Hey everybody, Dr. Seagren here. And you'll notice I'm not at the computer today. That's because this is not going to be a lecture. Instead, we are going to do a virtual lab. And how this is going to work is you're going to follow along and make observations about the things that I'm back at school. So you're going to follow along and make observations about the different chemistry that we're doing today. And our lab today is going to be about acids and bases and chemical reactions. And basically, you know, we can't do hands-on labs this year. Obviously, we're doing virtual stuff. But what we can do is you can watch along as I do different things and make observations and answer questions as we go through. And we're going to use a new tool and program today where you get to answer questions as we follow along with the video. For example, alright, so let's get into a little bit about what we're going to be doing. So we are going to be determining the pH of different chemicals that you can see in front of me. And as a reminder, the pH, there's something called a pH scale, which anything below 7 is an acid, anything above 7 is a base. So that's how we're going to measure whether something is an acid or a base. And that can also give us an idea of the relative strength of the acids and bases. So as you go lower on the scale towards 0, those are stronger acids. And as you go higher on the scale towards 14, those are going to be stronger bases. How are we going to determine what's an acid and a base? We're going to use our friend the chemical indicator that I also talked about last class. These are basically little test papers. And when you put these little papers and dip them into each substance, they're going to change a color depending on the pH of that substance. So we'll do that. First, let's just go through all the chemicals that we have and see if we can make some educated guesses or hypotheses about whether or not they might be acids or bases.
All right. So when you're talking about trying to make a prediction of something, if something might be an acid or a base, it's important to kind of be reminded of what makes an acid or a base an acid or a base. As we learned last class, usually acids will release something called a hydrogen ion, and hydrogen on the periodic table is indicated by an H. So generally speaking, if you see an H in something, that could be an indicator it's an acid if we're looking at the chemical formula. What about bases? Well, last class I said that another term for being a base or being basic in chemistry is known as being alkali. And we have a group of substances over here known as the alkali metals. And so that could be, if you see one of these substances in the chemical formula of these different chemicals that we're going to go over in a second. So if we see anything like lithium, Li, beryllium, Be, sodium, Na, Mg for magnesium, or K for potassium, Ca for calcium, any of those tend to be alkali or basic when they form chemical bonds. So we can use a little bit of information and knowledge about different elements to give us some way to guess what each chemical might be before we actually test it.
All right, so let's go over our different chemicals that we're going to be testing today. Does it feel like you're doing a lab? It feels like I'm doing a lab. I don't know. Let's go over our first contender here. This is Tums. And Tums on the bottle says it's an antacid. And if you've never taken Tums before, you take Tums when you have an upset stomach or maybe some stomach burn or heartburn kind of situation. So what do we think? Could that be an acid or a base? One other thing, if we look at our back of our Tums container, we zoom in here. It's a little blurry, but I think you can make it out. The active ingredient is calcium carbonate. And I'll put up the chemical formula for that. The chemical formula is CaCO3. So let's make our prediction of whether or not we think Tums calcium carbonate is an acid or a base. All right, moving on to chemical number 2. This is going to be vinegar. And this is what it looks like. All right, the chemical formula for vinegar is CH3COOH. It's a pretty big molecule. It's got a lot of different elements to it. And that one could maybe go either way. Let's see. So we said it's clear. Let's see if it has a smell. Maybe that can inform us. It smells like vinegar. It's a bit sour smelling. So let's take a moment, make our prediction. Do you think it's an acid, a base? And let's describe it. All right, our next contender is going to be baking soda. You've probably seen this in the supermarket before. And I've dissolved it again in water here. This one seemed to dissolve a little better in water. And if we talk about its smell, it doesn't have much smell to it at all. All right. The chemical formula for this one is Na, which is sodium, HCO3. So maybe that'll give you a clue if it's acid or a base. So let's make our predictions and write down our description. All right, our next contender, chemical number 4, is going to be seltzer water. That's going to be carbonated water. So all it is water with carbon dioxide dissolved in it. And that's what creates those little bubbles. So as we're talking about the description, we can see it's got some little bubbles to it, especially if I shake it. Those, you guys have all had soda water before. We give it a smell. Doesn't smell like much. Smells a little bit grapey because it's a grape flavored. And the chemical formula for this one is H2CO3. So let's write down a description and whether or not we think it's an acid or a base. All right, our next contender, chemical number 5, is going to be Miracle-Gro fertilizer. Fertilizer is something we'll be talking about over the course of the year. So let's talk about the chemistry of it. Here's our color of it. Again, it's partially dissolved in water. You can see it's a white substance at the bottom here. Some of it dissolved in water, some of it still at the bottom. We take it to the smell test. No smell. Actually, anything the smell reminds me of vitamins or maybe urine kind of smelling. And if we talk about the chemical formula of fertilizer, so fertilizer is usually a blend of a couple things, including ammonia, which is NH3, but it also has something called potash, which is K2O. So the ammonia is nitrogen and hydrogen, whereas the potash is potassium and oxygen. So it's got a little blend of everything. So let's make our prediction, acid or base. All right, our next contender, chemical number 6, is ammonia. And ammonia is a household cleaner. I can tell you right now, I don't even have to do a smell test. I can smell it from here. It's burning my nostrils. I'm not putting my nose anywhere near it. It's very intense smelling. I wouldn't say it's sour or anything else. It's just really intense. And you might notice ammonia I just mentioned when I was talking about fertilizer. So yes, the chemical ammonia, NH3, is found in fertilizer. And this brings up an important point in chemistry, is that sometimes things are all about how concentrated they are. Concentrated ammonia will kill a plant. A little bit of ammonia will help a plant. Interesting. So, we already know the formula for this one. It's NH3 C3. So what do we think? Acid or a base? All right, our next contender is going to be rubbing alcohol. That's the one I lit on fire yesterday, or the other day. So this is isopropyl alcohol. I think we've probably all seen alcohol before. It smells like alcohol. I'm not going to smell it. I think you guys know the burning sensation you get from smelling alcohol. It's a clear substance, and the chemical formula for this one is C3H8O. So it's got some carbon in it, some hydrogen in it, and some oxygen in it. So what do we think? Let's go ahead and describe it and make a prediction. Acid or a base? And our last substance that we're going to test is none other than hydrochloric acid. This is usually pretty dangerous stuff, and I don't break it out when students are around, but hey, if I'm filming things in my off period with no students, I can break out whatever chemicals I want to. So this is what it looks like. It's a clear substance. I know I'm handling hydrochloric acid without gloves. Do as I say, not as I do. It's okay. This is not concentrated enough to actually burn me, unless I got it in my eye or something, which is why I'm wearing goggles. So that's the appearance, the smell of it. It has a slight, I would just say burning sensation when you smell it, so I'm not really I'm gonna waft this one. Yeah, slight burning sensation when you smell it, otherwise no other smell. I think it's pretty clear if this one's an acid or a base, based on the fact that it's called hydrochloric acid. But as a fun fact, this is the same kind of acid that you have in your stomach. And, oh, look at that warning. Corrosive to body tissue. Yes. You don't want to get this stuff on you. And the chemical formula for this one is HCl. All right, so that goes through our 8 chemicals that we have. And so now for determining the pH. And again, how that works is we use this stuff called pH strips. Sometimes it's called litmus paper, and all you have to do is dunk it in the substance and see what the color changes to. So that's what we're going to do here. Let's dunk. And let's see, what do you think the pH is? Alright, that was kind of an interesting reaction, but the longer I waited and as the paper kind of dried and some of the water dried, there is a tendency for some of these bases, when they are solids that are dissolved into water, the water kind of blocks seemingly the function of the pH strip a bit, as sometimes there can be a bit of a chemical reaction between water and a base, and that disrupts the pH. But after it dried off a bit, the pH of this one, the Tums, has changed again. So there you go. I think that's a better official pH. So what do you guys see? And does this make this an acid or a base? Remember, as our last reminder here, if it's above a 7, it's a base, and if it's below a 7, it's an acid. All right, let's move on to our next chemical. This is vinegar. Let's see what we get with vinegar. Well, that's a pretty clear color change there this time. And what do you think for the pH of vinegar? And is it an acid or a base? All right, now on to our next substance, the baking soda. Let's see how we're doing here. I'm going to dunk. All right, pretty clear chemical change there. So that's an initial reading. Let's wait for a second and see if this dries up and changes anymore. All right, I think that's about as dry as it's going to get. It might have changed a little bit more, but let's see. What do you think? Is this a acid or a base? And what is the pH? All right, let's move on to our next chemical here. This is going to be our carbonated water. And let's see what happens. Well, there's our initial result there. I'll let you be the judge of the color change there. Not too much. What do we think? An acid or a base? And what is the pH? Alright, let's see what happens with our next one. This is our fertilizer. Is it going to be an acid or a base? I'll let you be the judge. What's the pH? Is it an acid or a base? Alright, the super smelly one. This is ammonia. What do we think? Let's see what happens. Dunk it. Whoa. That's a really strong reaction there. So let's see, what do we think? Acid or a base? Write down the pH as well. Alright, next we're moving on to alcohol. What do we think? Let's see what happens. Dunk it. Not too much there. So what do we think? Acid, base, neutral? What's the pH? Alright, and we're running out of room a little bit here on the edge of the table. Well, let's see. We have hydrochloric acid. I wonder what it's going to be, an acid or a base? Well, look at that. Pretty obvious color change there. Take a moment, write down the pH, and if it's an acid or a base. Alright, let's take a moment and review our results. With the Tums, we got a kind of greenish color, so that would correspond to kind of a weak. Greenish color is around a 9, maybe even an 8. That's kind of a weak base for calcium carbonate. For vinegar, we got a pretty deep red color, indicative of a decently strong acid. And that would probably be about a 2 on the pH scale, I would say. For baking soda, pretty greenish, even getting into blue, so a little bit of a stronger base there, maybe a 10 on the pH scale. Moving on to carbonated water. At first, when I first dunked it in, I think it was in slightly orangish, and you can kind of see that in some of the table. I think on the table when I put it down, there is a little bit of this white powder, which is baking soda, and that might be corrupting the pH strip. But on the side where you can see here on the right, it's maybe a little bit orangish, so maybe something like a 5-ish. Carbonated water is a slight acid. It's a very weak acid. With the ammonia, we pretty much, right now it's maybe slightly orange. That could be just the tap water is slightly acidic, but generally when we dunked it in, it pretty much stayed yellow. Ammonia was our strongest base. We can see that color is almost completely blue now, and so that would make it a pretty strong base, an 11 or so on the scale. Our alcohol was a whole lot of nothing, so this just goes to show you that not everything is an acid or a base. This is around a 7. You can see it's about yellow, didn't really change color, so that's pretty indicative that alcohol is neither an acid or a base. Not everything is an acid or a base, so that one just goes to show you. And the last one we did, which was hydrochloric acid. We would probably expect hydrochloric acid, that sounds pretty intense, to be a really strong acid, and look at that color. My goodness, it's a deep, deep red. This is probably even lower than 1 on the pH scale. Strong stuff. Alright, so there you have it. We kind of reviewed 8 pretty common chemicals in the world, and all of these chemicals, or most of them, will come up again in the class, so it's good for us to begin discussing them. But what you can see is that there's a wide range of pHs here, and acids and bases. So, generally speaking, A strong acid and a strong base will have a very strong chemical reaction with one another. Generally speaking, not only can we learn what is an acid or a base, but we can also kind of compare the strengths of different things with this approach of measuring pH. So now I want to ask you to make a prediction about what sorts of these chemicals would you expect to react with one another. So I just reviewed, and you can go back and watch again as I reviewed each one. So basically you're going to say whichever ones are the strongest acids and the strongest bases will most likely have some kind of chemical reaction with one another. So let's talk a little bit about chemical reactions. What sorts of things could you expect to see during a chemical reaction? We saw one chemical reaction in our last video when I lit the table on fire. So we could see something crazy like that, like fire, but some other chemical reactions, signs of chemical reactions would be things like lots of bubbles, foam, and fizzing. We could have a color change as the chemicals are reacting and rearranging those molecules and atoms. We could have a change in smell. We could have something dissolve. Any of those things are possible with chemical reactions. Alright, so some of the things that you might have said, you would potentially pick out your strongest bases and strongest acids. Our strongest two bases were probably ammonia and baking soda, with maybe a runner-up being the Tums, the calcium carbonate. Those were all reasonably strong bases, with apparently ammonia being the strongest. And amongst our acids, we had hydrochloric acid and vinegar as our strongest acids, and with a maybe runner-up of carbonated water as being a weak acid. So potentially, if we took something like hydrochloric acid and we mixed it with ammonia, that would create a chemical reaction. Because one is a strong acid and one is a strong base. Also, something like hydrochloric acid and baking soda or calcium carbonate would probably also create a decently strong reaction. Same with vinegar and any of these things. So vinegar was a reasonably strong acid, probably going to react with ammonia or with baking soda or with calcium carbonate. So let's put that to the test. Let's begin mixing a few of these and recording what we observe. Alright, so this is going to serve as our chemical reaction beaker, and so you'll be able to keep an eye on any changes. Any changes that in smell or in appearance I can kind of help describe to you, and hopefully anything else that happens you will be able to see. So let's start out with our strongest base, which was ammonia, and our strongest acid, which was hydrochloric acid, and let's see what happens. Ammonia first. So I will tell you, this is one of the strongest smelling chemicals, on planet Earth. I can smell it from here. It smells horrible. So that's something we'll keep an eye on. Oof. Yes, that's something we'll keep an eye on, is if there's a smell change. Let's add a bit of hydrochloric acid to it. Well, wasn't that exciting? You can give it a slight stir here. A little bit foamy. That might have just been from the ammonia in general. Well, that is one of the things about science, is that not everything always blows up. Yes, this is a strong base and a strong acid, and yes, they are chemically reacting. They are producing something called ammonium chloride right now. But there isn't much visually that happens. One thing I can do is feel the container, see if it feels warmer or cooler. Maybe slightly warmer. I can also give it a smell test now. No smell anymore. So what happened is that really strong smelling compound of ammonia was completely neutralized, and the atoms rearranged themselves into new molecules, and the new molecule, which is ammonium chloride, is basically just a type of salt. So what we managed to do here is create a bit of salty water And the caustic nature of ammonia and hydrochloric acid, both of those which burn your nose if you smell them, is basically completely neutralized. I can put my nose right in this and smell it, and doesn't smell like anything. Kind of neat. All right, maybe let's try something different. So that first one wasn't too interesting, just a change in smell. Yes, there was a chemical reaction, but not everything always blows up or does something crazy. Let's try some other chemicals. What happens if we do our next strongest base, which was baking soda, and we mix that with hydrochloric acid? Let's see. All right, so we've got our baking soda in there. Let's see what happens. I'm gonna dump the rest of my hydrochloric acid, and let's watch and record what we noticed. Well, that was a little bit more exciting. What happened here is that the sodium in the baking soda, which is sodium bicarbonate, broke off and combined with the chlorine in the hydrochloric acid, resulting in simply NaCl, sodium chloride, which is, there's just simple table salt. In the process, though, a bit of carbon dioxide breaks off, and so this reaction results in three things: salt, water, and carbon dioxide that breaks off, and the carbon dioxide that breaks off has to bubble out of the solution, and that's the violent reaction that we just saw there. Pretty neat. Let's record what we saw and explain why it happened. Well, let's see. I've just spent most of the chemicals already. So we saw what happened with baking soda and hydrochloric acid and ammonia with hydrochloric acid. Let's move down the scale to some of our weaker acids and bases. So let's use our Tums, our calcium carbonate, and I have a whole bunch of vinegar. Let's see what happens between those two reactions. Tums, calcium carbonate, and vinegar. All right, here we go. So we have a pretty weak base and a reasonably strong acid here. Let's see what happens. Well, we saw a kind of similar, I hope that picked up on the camera. There was a bit of fizzle there, but it was kind of weak compared to our strong base and strong acid. So a similar reaction, and you can hear it sizzle there. As I stir it and kind of move these molecules together a little bit closer, and I kind of stir it up, you can see and probably hear a little bit of the fizz. That is pretty typical of chemistry. If you have strong acids and bases, they're going to be more violent in terms of their reaction compared to weak acids and weak bases. But we still got a little bit of a reaction. All right, so let's take a moment and kind of write a short summary of what we learned today from our virtual lab. Just to help you out, you learned what different chemicals might be acids or bases and why they might be acids or bases from the elements on the periodic table. You learned maybe that acids and bases can react with one another, and that not all chemical reactions are going to be violent explosions, but that can happen sometimes. You might have learned that not everything is an acid or a base. For example, alcohol is a very powerful chemical, but it isn't an acid or a base. It's functionally neutral. So there you go. So let's take a moment and write a little summary. Our discussion of acids and bases and the pH scale and all that stuff is going to lay our foundation for the next two video lectures. In particular, we're going to focus on a chemical reaction that we didn't see today because it's a very weak reaction and you don't see much, but between calcium carbonate and carbonic acid. And that reaction is happening and has been happening every day in the world, multiple places all around the world, multiple times a day, all day, every day, for the last several billion years. And it's a pretty neat process, and that's what we'll talk about next class. Well, I hope you learned something and that this virtual lab wasn't too boring. Maybe a little bit more interesting than the normal lectures. And we'll see how it looks in video editing and how it all comes together. But I hope you had fun and enjoyed it. I know it would have been more fun to do it all in person and hands-on, but this is the best we can do this year. So take it easy. I'll see you guys later.